Hello everyone. So today we're going to talk about physics. So physics within Maya is pretty simple and easy to use, and you have a lot of different things you could do with it. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go and create a plane, just for example for today. So I'm just going to create a plane, and I'm going to create a sphere, just to have something to work with right now. So this is just going to be our basic demo project. And what we're going to do is we're going to add physics to this. So let's just say we wanted this to be our ball, and we wanted it to bounce along the ground. Normally you would go in and you'd kind of keyframes, kind of where it is, bounce it, and do the squash and stretch and all that, which works really well and it's usually how people will do an animation. But let's just say you want something a little more realistic to the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to use physics-based dynamics. So in order to do that, it's pretty simple to start up, and you have a lot of things you could tweak with it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my modeling tab right here, and I'm going to change that to FX. So here we'll have access to a bunch of different little tools. We have N particles, which is if you want to make particles. We might do a video on that later on. Fluids, if you want to make fluids or liquids, we might do that as well. N cloth, I'm going to have a video up about this later after this one. Hair, if you want to create dynamic hair. N constraints we'll talk about later on. Field and solvers we're going to be using a lot today. And effects we might get into another time. So what we're going to do is I'm going to select my sphere. I'm going to go into field and solvers, and we have a bunch of different tools we can work with. We have things like air, drag, gravity, things like that, but we're going to focus on this right here. Active rigid bodies and passive rigid bodies. So what an active rigid body is basically an object that can interact with other objects and move around as we need. So things like balls or cups or anything that's going to interact with the world around it. So I'm going to create an active rigid body for our sphere. So just like that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my plane. I'm going to go back to field and solvers, and I'm going to create a passive rigid body. So the difference between the two is this sphere will be affected by gravity, but this plane will not. Think of it in the sense of this plane right here is going to be the ground. You don't really move the ground unless you actually have to. Or consider this as an unmovable wall or something like that. So if I hit play on my animation right now, nothing should happen. And even though they have the active and passive rigid bodies attached to them, we do need to have gravity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my sphere again. I'm going to go to field and solvers, and I'm going to add a gravity node. I'm just going to click that. We don't need to change anything. By default, it goes with a standard Earth's gravitational pull. And I'm just going to hit play. And now you can see my sphere bounce, just as it would normally. So that works really, really well. So getting into the rigid bodies of our project, we have initial velocity. So let's just say I change my initial velocity for x to 5. That means it should move over this way with a little bit of force. So if I hit play again, oops, we do have to hit enter on it just so it saves. So let me start that over, hit play. As you can see that it's kind of moving towards the side right there, which is great because we could do a bunch of different things with that. So I'm going to leave that right there. I might move my sphere over this way just so if I hit play, I'll kind of have a little bit more of a bounce to roll around. So we have initial spin, which kind of works the same way. So let's just say I want to change this to 20, and I hit play again. It has a little bit of spin on it. It'll give you a little bit more of a natural style roll, but it really depends on your actual object. The center of mass is very interesting. It basically says where its literal center of mass is. So by default, it starts right in the center of the object. So if I change this center of mass to, let's just say 2 right now, and I press play, it should roll and bounce in a very weird way because the center of mass is off. So you can get a lot of weird, funky things with that. I don't really use it too often, but you have that option. We're not going to really talk about impulses too much. We don't really need to. Mass is basically how much mass it has. So if I increase this, it will be a little more dense than it would be. Let me just save it for once and press play. It will be a little bit more dense. You don't really see it too much in your animation, but when you have it interacting with other objects, it'll come into play. The bounciness is a really fun one to work with. So let's just say I change it to 2. and I hit play, it should kind of get launched. And you can see how bouncy it is now. So let's just change that back to the default 0.6. Damping basically means how much the objects it's hitting are going to affect the bounce of this object and how it moves. So if we increase it, that means it's going to kind of slow it down a lot more. Same thing kind of goes with the static friction and dynamic friction. We're not going to really use those too much though. The next one we have is the collision layer. And these come into play if you want certain objects to be affected and some you don't want to be affected. So like as of right now, this sphere is on collision layer 0, as is this plane. So what that means is this sphere will collide with the plane and it will interact with each other. But if I changed it, let's just say I had another object here and change it to 1, then it would go through the floor as if it wasn't there. So a lot of different things we could do with this. The rest of the stuff you kind of just want to mess around with over time, and you can kind of get really interesting things going. So the next thing I'm going to do is let's just kind of create a couple more objects. So what I'm going to do is right here, I'm going to make some rough shaped dominoes. That looks pretty good. And what I'm going to do is I want to get them close to the ground because I am going to add gravity to them and make them active rigid bodies, but I also want to make sure that they don't go through the ground. You don't want it to go through the ground because it's going to end up interrupting things and you're going to have some weird funky simulations going on. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to take these and duplicate them a couple times just so we have some stuff going on. You could even get something funky by just kind of rotating and moving them around a bit, just like this. So all I'm really doing right now is kind of just moving my quote-unquote dominoes into this shape. So I'll just make another one, just so we have it going somewhere. I'm going to take my sphere and I'm going to move it back. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change all of these to active rigid bodies. I'm going to create the gravity again, just to make sure that they're affected as well. And I'll hit play. And now, as my sphere goes, it should knock into my dominoes. Oops, I do need to add a little bit more time to my animation. So let's just go for 200 frames. So let's start it up from the beginning. And there we go. And it works pretty well. So we can do a lot of other things with this. So let's just say I want to, I don't know, let's make this cone. I could go in and make this cone right here. Let's just say we'll make it a passive rigid body. And let's just say I want it to start over here, and I'll key the translate. And then let's just say by around here, I'm going to have it go across the other side. I'll key those. And the reason why I'm doing this is because you could actually have these passive rigid bodies interact with the active rigid bodies, even though they're not really moving, but we can make them move. So if I hit play, have it go through, let's actually make sure it hits this area. So I'm going to go key that. Let's see, will it stop right there? And it will interact with it. So with this process being done, you could have a lot of fun with like making Rube Goldberg machines, just kind of simple domino effects and things like that. In the end, working with these physics is kind of like a trial and error type of project or process, because you're never really sure what's going to work, and it kind of comes into play a lot of different times. One thing I will note is doing simulations like this are going to end up giving you very long render times. So just keep that in mind, and if you really want to work with it, you're going to want to bake your animations at a later time. But for short ones, it should be fine. So in the next video we're going to talk about end cloths and creating cloths dynamics. So see you then.